Hello again, everybody, and welcome to our latest edition of Making Waves, our inside look at Roosevelt University athletics. Joined now by a recent hire here at Roosevelt University, new track and field and cross-country coach Michael Moffitt. And Coach, welcome to Roosevelt University. It has to be an exciting time for you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. Very excited to be in Chicago full time and kind of taking over the program and getting it to the place it needs to be.
If I can, to go back in time a little bit, was there a point earlier on in your track and field and athletics journey where you decided that you wanted to be a coach and that coaching was the right path for you?
Yeah, I originally came into college as a graphic design major, realized I couldn't stay still that long at a computer, transitioned to political science and psychology, and then got my degrees in that, but realized I really just wanted to kind of mentor and help people. So towards I think my end of junior year, beginning of senior year, I realized I wanted to get into coaching and athletics, and I wanted to continue competing. And so my track coach was like, hey, I know you're kind of a fifth year, so let's do a gap year, be an admissions counselor, then come be our graduate assistant and get your feet wet and coaching, and kind of just took off from there.
And that's one thing that is, I think, of always great interest to coaches at any sport at any level, and that is that a lot of people watching the events, they concentrate on what moves are made, during a football or basketball or baseball game, but there's a separate side to coaching, and you touched upon it. That's the mentoring and teaching aspect.
Yeah, I think the really cool thing about track and field, specifically in cross country, is there's a million ways to do it. I've got to talk to a lot of really great coaches, and they're like, hey, I do it this way. My mentor did it this way. There's like a million different things you can do. So the main thing is just, again, the relationships you build with the athletes, because if they don't know what they're doing or why they're doing it, they're probably not going to do it very well. So I think that's the number one thing, is just making sure you have that good relationship with the athletes. And then from there, I think you can pretty much do whatever as long as they have buy-in.
You mentioned that there are so many different ways to approach the coaching aspect of things. It almost sounds as if try to determine what's best for you and what the right path is for you to get the job done.
Yeah, and a lot of times I got to be flexible, and I think you no matter what the event is, you coach the athlete, you coach the person, not the event. And my philosophy is, if it's weird and it works, I don't really care as long as it works. And I played basketball my freshman year of college too, and I ended up having 3 stress fractures in my back we didn't know about, and so I couldn't Olympic lift or do anything for a year. And my mom was my coach, and so she had me on some really weird stuff. I was like in a sand pit with resistance bands and jumping out of the sand into a box because I couldn't do normal plyos and all this stuff. So you have to definitely get very creative. And so a lot of the times I sit down with the athletes before we start, and it's like, hey, what are your injury histories? What do you like to do? What do you hate to do? Understanding they're probably going to have to do some of that, and then try to tailor it to them to make it work.
How does having previously been a student athlete help as far as your approach to coaching goes?
I think you just understand that, it's rough, especially with track and cross country. It's not necessarily fun. No one goes out and except distance runners are like, hey, let's go run just for fun. Usually it's like, hey, let's go play basketball or swim or volleyball. So getting up, 5 a.m. and going to lift or work out, like, you do not want to be doing that. And I think it gives you the perspective of, as an athlete, I think everyone knows what they really liked about their coach and what they really would have preferred to be different. So I think even as athletes, you kind of take notes of like, hey, I ever coach, this is what I want to do, this is what I don't want to do. And having coaches in my family and living with coaches and kind of seeing how they handle those things, I think really helped me figure that out. And also, student athlete, you understand like, hey, this is a hard workout. When I first got out of competing and into coaching, I gave my athletes this workout, and they're like, this is really hard. And I was like, it's not that hard. I did it. And then I realized I hadn't done anything for 2 years. I'm like, this is really hard. Maybe I need to kind of modify this as well. And then just understand like they're people. They're not robots that are just going to be able to be perfect 24/7 all the time. Looking at them like holistically of like, hey, yeah, I get them for maybe 5-10% of their day, and there's 22, 23 other hours that are going to impact when they come in. So kind of making sure like, hey, there's other stuff going on. Let's see what we can control within that outside noise.
And after your student-athlete career, obviously previous coaching experience as well, 1 year at Eastern in Pennsylvania, Eastern University, and then you oversaw the program at Grace College in Indiana and made it into a national power. So that's great experience coming into this role, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Going from I was an AI athlete to then D3, back to an AI, and then D2. You kind of see a little bit of everything, and then it's really nice to – I had one really great coaches helping me along the way. that made my job very easy. But just kind of gives you an understanding of like, hey, this is what we need to do to build the right way, and not trying to do too much too quickly to where you run yourself into kind of a corner or a wall.
Also spending time at Purdue Northwest, so you have experience within the GLIAC. I assume that will be a great help as well.
Yeah, it's really nice coming, going into a school that you're already familiar with the conference is really easy rather than like no one knows who you are. You have no idea what's going on. You're trying to like connect with people, find people out. So kind of understanding that hey, this is what we need to do to be competitive at the conference level. This is what we need to do to, these are the strengths and weaknesses within the conference of recruiting, and this is how we can score points and be familiar with the area, where to go for meets, things like that is one less thing you kind of have to worry about the transition.
Was moving within the conference part of maybe the appeal that brought you to Roosevelt?
Yeah, and so I was living in Chicago already. Me and my wife have been living in Chicago for about a year, so I was commuting like anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour and a half to Hammond. And so the kind of goal, like after I left Eastern, was getting to Chicago, as close to Chicago as I could, to be with around my wife's family more. And so when this kind of came up, I was like, that's 9 minutes from my house. And so like that was a definite easier commute getting over here. And my wife and I are going to probably be in Chicago forever. And so this was like, I really wanted to, in my coaching journey, be somewhere long-term and build that up and have pride in that. And my mentor, my head coach when I was in college, just retired last year, and he's been there for 37 years. And so that was something I always really liked, especially with kind of my generation of coaches. We don't stay somewhere very long. It's, I'm going to bounce to this to try to get a little bit more money or a higher division. And I think Roosevelt's like a perfect fit. So I'm hoping to be here for a very long time and build that up. So that this is somewhere I saw where I was like, I can be here for a long time. It makes sense checks all the boxes. And so I was really excited when it came up.
Talking about being a coach for both cross country and track and field, two different disciplines. Are there areas that you have to navigate when you're coaching both at the same time?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the main things is completely different types of athletes, completely different demands, different needs for the distance kids. And like I said, there's different ways to do it. I've come from a very, very high volume program where they're running 100 plus miles a week, and their hard days are pretty hard and their easy days are very, very almost mind-numbingly easy to get that volume in, and understanding like, hey, when you do that, they're going to probably take a year before they pop off and start progressing really, really well, but it does work out in the end. And then that was more when I was at Indiana Wesleyan. Grace College, and in some degree probably Purdue Northwest too, were more, I think, speed based or a little more mid distance, lower mileage, more intensity. And I've seen both work. And I think you just have to talk to the athletes, kind of talking to some of the cross kids right now. I know they're probably more on a lower mileage, mid distance to higher mid distance mileage. So you don't just come in and change everything. You got to meet them where they are, and kind of, especially if they're seniors, transition it in. So I think, that mid distance, lower end, quote lower end, it's still, like we said, they're running more than I drive in a day. Lower end mileage for them is probably going to be what works best. But again, you've seen there were a couple of years ago we had national champions in cross country at D1, and they're like, yeah, I run 20 miles a week, and they're cross training like crazy. So I think for that, that's a different aspect you have. For track, I mean, you're talking about a million events, and within those events you can do things differently. You have more power athletes, more technical athletes, more speed athletes, and a combination. So again, it's like I'm very power based in my training for the track and field, so a lot of speed days, a lot of resistance training, contrast training with like a TA package, like a resistance towing machine. I just do a lot of speed and a lot of technical work, and then making sure we work in those recovery days. So typically we'll hit 2 higher CNS, central nervous system, demanding days in the week, and then we'll also do some aerobic work and speed work. So again, very different no matter what. That's written on paper, not in stone. I'll probably every week I've coached, I've thrown something out and changed it, whether that be injury or just needing to modify to what we have. But yeah, completely different gears. You kind of have to switch your mindset when you go from cross practice to track practice.
When you look at where you are now as opposed to when you began coaching, do you do anything different now? Are you constantly tweaking your process?
Yeah, if any of my first year athletes from Eastern are watching this, I'm so sorry. I would have changed almost, I think, everything that I did. To be fair, we had COVID during my first head coaching job, so like we weren't allowed like really on tracks for most of the time. We had to share with like, East Coast field hockey and lacrosse. So I would have definitely changed everything. I think being primarily a jumper in college, I looked more tempo based for my training for the track and field, and honestly even the cross country is a lot more high mileage. And I think just for my personal style, as I've evolved and know like, hey, this is what I know to do well, and I know it well enough to modify it on the fly if I need to. I've gone more again that power and speed base, but I definitely would have done way more speed work. Probably progressed some of the training a little bit to be a little bit more intense as the year went on, and I think I was just so scared to screw something up. I'm like, I know they won't get hurt if I do this. We'll keep it here with what we got, but definitely would have probably progressed things a lot more quickly and a lot more intensely. But at that point, I was just trying to keep people healthy. So, yeah, would have done a lot of stuff almost completely different. I think one of my colleagues, Nate Wadley, he was our strength and conditioning coach at Grace. He had a saying, every year I want to make myself from the previous year look like an idiot. And I totally agree with that. I think I do some type of certification or training like once a week. I just want to constantly kind of soak in information and then filter it out to where it makes more sense for me and the team.
We talked earlier on about being a mentor and being a teacher to the student athletes. And I think one aspect as well that might be not as well known is the fact that coaches as well are going through a learning process, aren't they?
Right. Yeah. I think I'm calling up someone all the time. I've been fortunate enough where coaches from like Purdue, Louisville that I kind of met at conventions, these coaches are national coaches of the year, and you send them a DM, they're usually pretty open. And I was like, I remember I emailed the Purdue jumps coach like last week, and I was like, hey, I know we talked at the convention about how you're kind of chaining the CNS system with the med balls when your kids aren't healthy enough to sprint. Like, is this kind of the structure you're using? I gave him some numbers. Like, just call me, give me a cell phone. And that's, awesome. You don't necessarily expect that. So I'm constantly reaching out to coaches and just trying to get better. And I've done a couple really cool mentorships with Altus, which is formerly the World Athletics Training Center. They kind of do the Olympic development. I did a couple years ago, I did a 9-month internship with them. And then I did just this last year, a 4-month internship more on video. And so constantly trying to get into cohorts and just people who are more experienced than me, a lot more intelligent than me, get their input, and then, hey, what do I understand from this? And then how can I kind of implement that and plug it in?
You talked earlier on about the technical aspect, especially for track and field. How do you approach that? How do you mentor a track and field and or a cross-country student athlete on a day-to-day basis, because the object obviously is to get to a point as quick as possible? How do you coach that, and how do you bring out the best effort in the student athletes when it comes to the technical aspect?
Yeah, and kind of like we talked about earlier, they got to buy in, they have to know. And some coaches do it, no disrespect to them, but I always hated when you go into a practice and say, hey, why are we doing this? And the coach says, well, because I said so. And I was like, okay, well, great. Now I'm scared and I don't know what's going on because this workout's going to, kick my butt. And so for all of my training, usually they're training a month in advance. So every Monday or whatever the first of the month is, they have the whole 4 weeks going on. And at the bottom of every column, it basically goes Monday through Saturday. I say, like, this is why we're doing this, and this is, like, the purpose. So they can kind of walk into a practice, know, like, hey, if they just had 4 exams, they're mentally drained, they know how to prepare for it, or we might switch the workout. But that buy-in aspect is great. And then I kind of, I'm very much feedback. Let's talk through it. Like, hey, I'll say, like, do you get this? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay, explain to me. I don't get it. Okay, that's fine. This is actually what we're trying to do, and you walk them through it. Because I'd rather spend 90% of the practice slowing it down and walking them through it so they understand it. So again, we got a long, long season. I'm okay with taking the first couple practices and really just like breaking it down for them. And I feel like for most athletes, availability is the best ability, keeping them healthy. And so we do a lot of technical work, like you said. It's a lot of like drilling, finding the right patterns, filming it so they can see it. And usually it's a software issue versus a hardware issue. Like, it's not that they're not strong. It's that they don't know how to fire their muscles or wake up their central nervous system properly. I had a kid at my last school that could squat a house, but he constantly had hamstring issues, not because his hamstrings were weak. He just didn't know how to fire it. So once I was like, you're not doing sprint work. He's like, nope, we're going to do very, very slow accelerations. And I'm going to critique how you're running. We're going to film it. And then all of a sudden his hamstring issues went away. Started getting personal bests over and over again. So again, kind of back to the relationship aspect of they need to know why they're doing what they're doing, and then not being afraid to slow it down and like step back throughout the workout. And I think that's how you progress them faster. Like once they intellectualize it, they'll start progressing faster and faster.
One thing that I've always been fascinated about with track and field, that's with the start, say for the 100-meter dash.
Okay.
Start of a race. I mean, it happens in a split second, and it has to be a challenge. And I assume you look maybe on super slow-mo video, because one slight difference can mean the difference between success and not getting there first. And what's amazing about it is it can come down to thousandths of a second. How do you get through that?
I think the main thing is telling them, one, you're not Usain Bolt. You see these social media, they're on TikTok, they're on, Twitter, they're on Instagram, they're looking at everybody's like, well, this is what this person does. I'm like, that person is literally insanely gifted. There's like 5 people on the planet that look like that and can do that. And they also work extremely hard, and they're 30. So they've been doing this for longer than you've been alive. So a little bit different aspects. And I think it's like you have to, like I said, you have to coach the athlete, not the event. The different, I'm about 6'6", Usain Bolt's about 6'5". I'm like, if we both start being, a 5'8" sprinter, I'm going to be down way longer because it takes my body way longer to get up. So you can't look at the person next to you and say, hey, I've got to do exactly what they're doing. So for technical work, I'd like to have them go like one by one, so they're not trying to race each other, and they're not trying to compare that to each other. But one of the simple things to do, if you don't have time to slow-mo video every single athlete in a session, or you're recording it later, 2 things, and this is usually the first practice that we actually do when we work on acceleration, is looking at dead stepping. And those are 2 different things you can do, where you overstride or understride. That, I think, for really raw athletes takes care of 90% of the issues, and then you can get really technical, which overstriding, usually football players or just really strong guys, you see them like kind of dip down and break at the hips. They're just kind of over extending their leg, and they fall and collapse forward. And usually football players do that because they're hitting someone off of the line, or they're going into a cut, a lot of multi-directional stuff. And then understriding, they just kind of do that speed skater side-to-side motion where they're wasting a lot of energy going this way instead of this way. And that's just from them, trying to get out of the blocks too quick, and they bring down their foot too quickly. And so they have nowhere, so they don't step into air. Their foot falls to the side to give them more room. So technically, I usually have 2 or 3 people go at a time. Like, we're looking at your dead step. That's the only thing we're doing this practice. Are you overstriding or understriding? And then depending on that, we drill it. And so that's something that I think throughout the year we look at. And I think if we can get those things squared away, that helps with most of it. And then as they get more coordinated and strong, it goes away. But yeah, I mean, you can do the whole block starts where you can measure their leg length and then all that. But I like, before we get into that, I'm like, you just need to make sure you can come out of the blocks, period, before we get into like the minute details of all that.
Conversely, with respect to cross country, it's a little bit of a different situation. Obviously, again, first across the finish line wins, but it's more about distance and more about pacing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing too, where, some people have a really aggressive start, some people have more of a kick at the end, a bunch of different strategies. The thing with cross, that's always, you really got to do your research. Is it can be very, very different. The courses are very different all the time. You don't have a consistent just circle that you're running around, even from indoor to outdoor. Remember when I was in Pennsylvania and I was looking at all these kids' times, like, these times aren't that insane. And then I was like, oh, it's super hilly. They're going down like 100-yard dip, and then they're going up 100 yards for half these courses. The context of like, well, that's something you're not going to see on paper. And so what we like to do is I'll usually have a weather report. It's like before we go into the meet, like, we'll sit down together. I'm like, hey, this is how hot it's supposed to be. These are probably the times of days you need to be hydrating or taking your electrolyte supplements or whatever. And this is the course. And we kind of, if we can, I'll like usually do Google screenshots of the course if it's available. Sometimes it's a golf course, so you kind of just have to do what you have to do. But saying like, hey, here's the map. This is typically when you want to do this or that. If this doesn't work, don't panic. Something that my mentor Coach Foss did at Indiana Wesleyan is for the first few meets, he packed them together a lot. So he's like, this group, you run together, you stay together for the first couple of meets, and then he kind of let them individualize it. So the bigger the team, the easier to do. The smaller team, the variance of speed might be a little bit different, but just kind of preparing them mentally for that, I think helps them figure out the pacing to where, if they have never run the course before, they're not running blind, kind of panicking, especially if they're, an underclassman.
You literally read my mind when when you were talking about the courses, and I was going to ask whether or not you actually went on Google Earth and you were able to zoom in. I mean, it's amazing how close and tight you get from a satellite shot, and you're able to take a look at the course and you're able to plan from that, aren't you?
Yeah, and like just this last year when we were at PNW at Olivet, like their course is a golf course and it has like no shade. So it was insanely hot there. So when, if we go to Olivet, it's like, hey, we need to really make sure we're hydrating. I do not want you in the shade as possible. Like I know there's trees over there that's not on the course. Do all your warm ups over there. Make sure, we got the chili pads on their neck to kind of cool off the core temperature and understand like, hey, this is going to be a very, very hot course. It's going to be a fast course. Don't burn your wheels and go out too hot, too fast because you're going to burn out really quick because there's not going to be much of a break. So understand like you can tone it down a bit, especially with the heat. And I'd rather you finish than half the field drops out. We finish. If half the field's not there, that's going to be a plus for us.
Also, one unique thing about track and field and cross country is that you have both individual results and team results. Mm-hmm. Is there a specific approach you have to take when you're dealing with that kind of situation? It's not something you see in every sport.
Yeah, and so it's hard because you're competing against your teammates. And sometimes it's like, especially in cross country too, it's, hey, they're taking you off of your group time, but it's like, you might not win, but you can kick their fifth person back. And so even though you might not score, you can make sure their other person scores less points or scores more points in cross country's case. And so like there's a strategy to that. I think looking at our conference and looking at what points score well, it's like, hey, I could put you in 7 events to try to score 2 extra points, or I could put you in 3 events and just hope that you perform better during those 3 events and you score more points that way because you don't want to wear kids out, especially at conference. It's a multi-day meet. There's a lot, and you have prelims, which you don't always have. But using my philosophy, if it's not conference or nationals, I don't really care. If it's an invite or if it's just like, some Chicagoland championship, those are great. You can get a T-shirt or whatever. But my thing is like, if it's not conference, I am not going to run you to the ground. We might compete you every other weekend, depending if you're just a really high-intense athlete and you need more recovery time. Again, my main goal is to get them healthy through the year and prepare for conference and nationals. So if it's not conference or nationals, I'm not too worried about the score. And again, what can we actually have them do to where they're not burning themselves out and they're not so broken down that they're not even scoring?
Is it a case where, again, you emphasize conference or nationals? You can use maybe non-conference situations to get prepared for the meets that you're concentrating on down the road?
Yeah, definitely. And I think also, leading up to conference, indoors always at Grand Valley or at Saginaw, and then outdoors usually Grand Valley. So understand like, hey, as we go into conference, venue recognition, like, hey, let's make sure we're going to Grand Valley, maybe the last 2 meets or Saginaw or wherever conference is hosting. So when you get there, it's not your first time running on that course or competing on that. And some courses are weird, especially in the jumps are like on a slant or there's like a ditch or something. And so you're like, okay, hey, we know that's going to be there. We can't move it. So let's prepare. How do we attack this when we get there as well? And saying like, hey, these are teams that we're going to face during the conference season. Let's get you as much competition. I don't want to see everyone for the first time at conference because we're going off to completely different meets. And then also making sure like, hey, these are good competition for you. Let's go here instead of this place because you're going to get pushed to do better.
Is there a huge difference in preparing for a meet that might be indoors as opposed to outdoors?
Outside of weather, but that kind of affects everybody. You can't really help it. I know this year's conference outdoor, we during the multi, we went inside because it was just like monsooning and like the sand pit for the long jump, I don't think it moved. So they just jumped into basically nothing and they were afraid they were going to kind of hurt themselves. And you don't want to be throwing discus with no grip. And so they delayed that. They moved it inside, came back. So outside of just like a race strategy of running into, a 200 curve as opposed to a 400 curve, that's something we already work on technically in practice. So not too much of a difference other than there's just more events outdoor. So then we transition to how do we balance that out? Who do we choose to maybe add into events or hold out of events?
Finally, as we start to wrap things up here with Coach Michael Moffitt, head track and field and cross-country coach here at Roosevelt University, looking ahead to the future now as you take on this new role, what are your goals as you progress forward here, not only in the immediate but in the longer term?
Yeah, long term, I think, I want to be someone who's constantly competing to be in the top 3 of the conference, growing the size of the team. I think, eventually, in the next 3 to 4 years, I'd love to get the team up to close to like 60 kids right now. I think we're about half of that. And then for the immediate, I just want improvement. Like, again, I'm not super concerned on like where we're placing right now. Obviously, you want to strive and have goals, and that's something we go over as a team. But I just want to see people get better, see their confidence grow. Obviously there's been a lot of coaching turnover and I want to be here for a long time. So just establishing some stability, some consistency for the kids and, build some culture, build some traditions and have fun with it.
Sounds like, if I may use a baseball analogy, when you're behind by a certain amount, you can't hit a 5-run home run.
Exactly.
You can't hit an 8-run home run. And so you got to be you got to move along and take progressive steps as you move along. And it sounds like that's going to be your approach.
Right, and again, like bringing in the right people, high character, high academic, hard workers is what I want. And so again, I don't need to get 20 kids right now, 20 freshmen. I can take 5 or 10 that are really good, develop them, build that culture, then slowly add on a little bit every year to a little more controllable. And yeah, again, we're taking baby steps, but we're always going to try to get at least 1% better.
All right, Coach Moffitt, thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Making Waves, and best of luck as you start your journey here at Roosevelt University.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.